The porcelain shattered against my cheekbone with a sound like breaking ice, sharp and final. Blood mixed with champagne on the marble floor of Thornwood Manor while my mother stood above me, chest heaving, the jagged stem of my grandmother's vase still clutched in her hand. My sister Cassidy screamed from the doorway, not in horror at what had just happened, but in fury that I'd ruined her wedding week. That moment, with shards of century-old porcelain embedded in my skin and my father turning away as he always did, I understood something fundamental about my family. Violence dressed in silk and pearls is still violence. And secrets kept in historic manners still rot the foundations from within. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The notification appeared on my phone at exactly 3:47 on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of spring day in Portland when the light falls through studio windows like liquid gold and makes everything look softer than it really is. I was centering a bowl on my pottery wheel, my hand steady and sure, the clay spinning beneath my fingertips in that meditative rhythm that had become my refuge over the past 6 years. The wheel hummed. Rain tapped against the tall windows of my Pearl District studio. Outside, the city moved through its usual dance of coffee shops and food trucks, of cyclists and streetcars, of people living ordinary lives where families were supposed to mean safety instead of danger. My phone buzzed once against the wooden workbench. Then again. By the fourth vibration, I wiped my clay-covered hands on my apron and reached for it, leaving gray fingerprints across the screen. The image that loaded made my breath catch somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Cassidy stood in the center of the frame wearing a fitted ivory gown that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. Her blonde hair swept up in an elaborate twist, her smile wide and practiced and perfect. Behind her, the grounds of Thornwood Manor stretched out in their carefully manicured glory, the vineyard rows creating geometric patterns across the rolling hills of the Willamette Valley. Roses climbed the stone walls. White tints dotted the lawn. Everything looked like a painting of exactly what a family should be. The caption read in flowing script that Victoria probably spent 20 minutes perfecting. Some moments are too precious to share with anyone but those who truly matter. Family is everything. Cassidy Harper celebrates her final days as a Fletcher bride-to-be at Thornwood Manor. Below it, dozens of comments already bloomed like weeds. Congratulations poured in from cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, from Victoria's charity circle friends, from people who knew my family's public face but nothing of what happened behind Thornwood's hand-carved doors. I scrolled through every comment, looking for my name, knowing I wouldn't find it but needing to confirm my absence anyway. Aunt Marie wrote about how beautiful the family looked together. Uncle Thomas mentioned the Harper legacy continuing. Victoria's best friend Diane called it a dream come true for a mother. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't mentioned. In the background of one photo, I could see my father Richard standing near the wine cellar entrance, glass in hand, face turned away from the camera as if even in celebration he was searching for an exit. But there was no sign I had ever existed. No empty space where a daughter should have stood. No digital trace of the girl who used to run through those vineyard rows pretending the grapevines were forest giants and the irrigation ditches were rivers to cross. I had been edited out so completely that even the photographs seemed to have forgotten me. The clay on the wheel had stopped spinning. I looked down at my hands still covered in gray slip, and felt something inside my chest go very still and very cold. Not the hot flash of anger or the sharp stab of hurt, but something quieter and more permanent. The kind of cold that comes from finally understanding a truth you've been avoiding for years. They hadn't forgotten to invite me to Cassidy's wedding. They hadn't lost my number or assumed I knew or gotten confused about addresses. This was deliberate. Calculated. A choice made by people who had decided long ago that their version of family was cleaner, prettier, more valuable without me in it. I dried my hands and called my father. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, and I could hear the hollowness of Thornwood's great hall in the background, the echo of voices and laughter from whatever pre-wedding celebration was already underway. His voice when he spoke sounded thin, stretched tight over something fragile. "Natalie. Hello. Is everything all right?" As if I only called when emergencies happened, as if we existed to each other only in crisis. "I saw the photos," I said, keeping my voice level, watching rain streak down the studio windows. "Cassidy's getting married." Silence expanded on the other end of the line. I heard him take a breath, then stop, then try again. Yes. Yes, the wedding is this Saturday. It's been quite the production, you know how Victoria is about these things. He laughed, a small nervous sound that died quickly. She wants everything perfect for Cassidy. And nobody thought to tell me. It wasn't a question. Another pause, longer this time, filled with the distant sound of someone calling his name. Victoria probably, summoning him to taste wine or approve flowers or perform whatever role she'd assigned him in her carefully orchestrated production. Victoria felt it would be better this way. She thought your presence might create complications. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been practicing them, like he'd known this call would come and had prepared his script. Complications. Is that what we're calling family now? My hand tightened around the phone. Behind me, the pottery wheel sat motionless, the half-formed bowl already starting to dry and crack. Natalie, please try to understand. This week is important for Cassidy. For the family. The Fletchers are very prominent. And with the new vineyard expansion, we need everything to go smoothly. I understand perfectly, I said quietly. You're telling me I'm an embarrassment. That I don't fit the image Victoria's been building. That it's easier to pretend you have one daughter instead of two. He didn't deny it. The silence that followed told me everything his words wouldn't. Finally, he spoke again, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It's not personal, Natalie. It's just how things have to be right now. I ended the call without saying goodbye. Through the window, Portland spread out in shades of gray and green. The city I'd rebuilt my life in after leaving Thornwood Manor behind. 6 years ago, I'd driven away from that estate with 2 suitcases and my grandmother Eleanor's old pottery tools, the ones she'd used before she married into the Harper family and had to become someone more refined. I'd promised myself I would build something honest here, something clean and true that nobody could take from me. The studio around me felt suddenly too small. Shelves lined with completed pieces, bowls and vases and plates in earth tones and ocean blues, each one shaped by my hands and fired in the kiln that hummed in the back room. On the wall hung my business license, Natalie Harper Ceramics, and beside it a photo of my grandmother in her own studio, hands covered in clay, smiling with the kind of joy that comes from creating instead of performing. She taught me that pottery was about more than making beautiful things. It was about taking something broken and scattered and formless and giving it structure, purpose, meaning. She taught me that some materials needed to be fired to become strong, that heat and pressure could transform fragile clay into something that would last centuries. I hadn't thought about that lesson in a long time, but standing in my studio with my father's words still echoing in my ears and the evidence of my erasure glowing on my phone screen, I felt it settling into my bones. They thought they could fire me out of existence, reduce me to ash and dust and forgotten space. But firing doesn't destroy. It transforms. It strengthens. It makes permanent what was once soft and malleable. I looked at the photo again, really looked at it this time, studying not just what was there but what was missing. Victoria stood beside Cassidy with her hand on my sister's shoulder, her posture perfect, her dress precisely chosen to complement without competing. My father lurked in the background as always, present but somehow absent, a ghost in his own life. And Cassidy, 24 years old and radiant, looked exactly like the daughter Victoria had always wanted. Polished. Proper. Willing to smile for cameras and play her part in whatever story the family needed to tell. The thing about pottery is that you learn to see cracks before they become visible to anyone else. You learn to feel when something isn't centered properly, when the walls are too thin, when the structure won't hold under pressure. Looking at my family arranged so carefully in that photograph, I could see all the cracks they were trying to hide. The way my father held his wine glass like a shield. The tightness around Victoria's smile that suggested effort rather than joy. The way Cassidy's left hand gripped her engagement ring, turning it in circles, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood whenever she felt trapped. Something was wrong at Thornwood Manor. Something beyond the obvious cruelty of excluding me from a family wedding. I could feel it the way I could feel when a pot was about to collapse on the wheel, that subtle shift in energy that said the center wasn't holding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And because I had spent 6 years learning to trust my instincts instead of ignoring them, learning to pay attention to what my body knew before my mind could rationalize it away, I saved the photo to my phone and opened my laptop. The Harper Family Vineyards website loaded with the same elegant design Victoria had commissioned 3 years ago. All sweeping images of sunset over grapevines and testimonials about award-winning wines, and the legacy of 4 generations of winemaking excellence. There was a new section I didn't remember seeing before, a banner announcing the Thornwood expansion project, a partnership with Fletcher Agricultural Holdings to double the vineyard's production and establish Harper wines in international markets. Cassidy's face appeared in one of the promotional photos, standing beside a tall man with dark hair and an expensive suit. Owen Fletcher, the caption read, bringing innovation and investment to Oregon's wine country. So that was it. Not just a wedding but a merger. Victoria had finally found a way to monetize Cassidy's existence, to turn my sister into a transaction that would elevate the Harper name and secure Thornwood's future. I wondered if Cassidy understood what she was really signing up for, or if Victoria had wrapped the whole thing in enough white lace and champagne that the truth stayed hidden until it was too late to escape. I thought about calling my sister, but we hadn't spoken in over a year, not since the Christmas when I'd made the mistake of coming home and Victoria had spent the entire dinner explaining in elaborate detail why my pottery business was charming but not really a serious career. Not like Cassidy's marketing position at the vineyard, not like anything that mattered to people who understood real success. The rain had picked up outside, turning the streets slick and silver. I watched people hurry past with umbrellas, their reflections fragmenting in puddles, and felt the weight of the decision settling over me. I could let this go. I could accept that some families were better at pretending than loving, that some ties were better cut than maintained. I could keep building my quiet life in Portland, teaching pottery classes to retirees and making custom dinnerware for local restaurants, staying safely distant from the chaos that always seemed to swirl around Thornwood Manor. Or I could pay attention to the cracks I was seeing. I could trust the instinct that said something was deeply wrong, that my exclusion from Cassidy's wedding wasn't just an insult but a symptom of something larger and darker. The rational choice was obvious. The safe choice was clear. But I'd spent 28 years making the rational, safe choices my family preferred, swallowing my questions, ignoring my instincts, trying to smooth over the cracks instead of asking why they kept appearing. And where had it gotten me? Erased from family photos, excluded from major life events, treated like an inconvenience, a complication, something to be managed and hidden rather than loved and included. My grandmother Eleanor's voice came back to me then, something she'd said the last time I saw her before she died, when I was 17 and already starting to understand that Thornwood Manor was more prison than paradise. Natalie, she'd whispered, her hands frail but still bearing the calluses of decades of working with clay. You have something the rest of them lost. You can still see what's real. Don't let them convince you to go blind. I'd carved those words into the base of a vase I made the week after her funeral, hidden them where only I would know they existed. Now they echoed through my mind like a command, like permission, like the truth I'd been avoiding. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found David Mitchell's number. We'd gone to University of Oregon together, had stayed friends even after I dropped out to focus on my pottery apprenticeship, and he went on to get his MBA and join Pacific Northwest Trust and Loan. Last I'd heard, he was managing accounts for high-net-worth clients in the Willamette Valley, clients like the Harper family. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Natalie Harper. This is either a very good surprise or you need help hiding a body. Please tell me it's the body. Despite everything, I laughed. Not yet. But the day's young. I took a breath, watching the city blur through rain-streaked glass. I need to ask you something about my family. About Thornwood. The levity dropped from his voice. Officially or unofficially? He asked quietly, which told me he already knew something was wrong, had probably known for a while and been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Whichever way means you'll tell me the truth. I met David 3 days later at a coffee shop in the West Hills, far enough from downtown that we wouldn't run into anyone from the Portland art scene or the wine country social circuit. The place was called the Grinding Stone, one of those aggressively local establishments with exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and a chalkboard menu that changed daily based on whatever the owner felt like serving. David was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 ceramic mugs steaming in front of him, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over the chair beside him. He looked older than I remembered, lines carved around his eyes that hadn't been there in college, a weariness in his shoulders that spoke of too many hours managing other people's money and secrets. He stood when he saw me, pulled me into a brief hug that smelled like coffee and expensive cologne, then gestured to the seat across from him. Neither of us spoke until I'd settled in and wrapped my hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from the heat seeping through the clay. Portland had turned cold again the way it always did in late spring, the weather unable to decide between rain and sunshine, between winter's end and summer's promise. Through the window I could see Mount Hood in the distance, its peak still snow-covered and sharp against the gray sky. David took a long sip of his coffee, studying me over the rim with the kind of careful assessment that probably served him well in his line of work. When he finally set the mug down, his expression had shifted from friendly to professional, that invisible wall that people in finance learn to construct between their personal feelings and the information they were about to share. It was a look I recognized from my father, actually, that ability to compartmentalize emotion until it became something manageable and distant. "Before we start," he said quietly, leaning forward so his voice wouldn't carry to the other tables, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is information I shouldn't have access to anymore. Your stepmother moved the family accounts out of my direct management 8 months ago, transferred everything to a private wealth management firm in Lake Oswego. But I still have friends in the industry, people who owe me favors, and when I heard your name come up in a conversation I wasn't supposed to be part of, I started paying attention." He paused, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on the scarred wooden table. "What I found made me concerned enough that I've been waiting for you to call." My stomach tightened. Outside, a young couple walked past the window holding hands, laughing about something, their lives uncomplicated by the weight of family secrets and financial fraud. I envied them for a moment, then pushed the feeling aside and focused on David's face, on the worry etched there, on the fact that he'd been carrying this information for months waiting for me to be ready to hear it. "Tell me," I said simply. He reached into the leather messenger bag at his feet and pulled out a manila folder, thin but somehow heavy with implication. He slid it across the table toward me but kept his hand on top of it, holding it in place. 6 months ago, Victoria refinanced Thornwood Manor. The property had been paid off completely since your grandfather's time. No mortgage, no liens, free and clear. She took out a loan for $1.2 million using the estate as collateral. He lifted his hand, and I opened the folder to see a stack of documents, financial statements and loan applications and property assessments that blurred together into a narrative of debt and deception. $1.2 million, I repeated, trying to make the number make sense. Thornwood was worth easily 3 times that, maybe more depending on the vineyard's current production value and the land prices in Willamette Valley, which had been climbing steadily for the past decade as Oregon wines gained international recognition. For what? The vineyard expansion? David shook his head slowly, and something in his expression made my hands go cold despite the warm mug I was still holding. That's what the loan application says. Vineyard expansion, new equipment, marketing initiatives, all very legitimate sounding business purposes. But when I had someone track where the money actually went, it painted a different picture. He pulled out another document, this one a spreadsheet covered in transactions and dates and account numbers. His finger traced down the page, stopping at a series of wire transfers that began in January and continued through April. $300,000 to Belmont Event Design, that's the company handling Cassidy's wedding. Another $200,000 to Fletcher Agricultural Holdings, but not as investment like you'd expect. It was listed as a consulting fee, which makes no sense given that Owen Fletcher is about to marry into the family. Why would Victoria pay his company for consulting on a business merger that benefits both parties? Unless it wasn't really a consulting fee, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like nausea. Unless it was payment for something else. For him to marry Cassidy, maybe? For the Fletcher name to legitimize whatever Victoria's building? That's what I thought too, David agreed. But it gets worse. Another $400,000 went to something called Heritage Restoration Consulting LLC. I looked into it, Natalie. That company was created 8 months ago by Victoria herself. It exists only on paper, no employees, no office, no actual business operations. It's a shell company, and she's been funneling money through it, washing the loan funds through a fake business and then moving them somewhere else. He paused, met my eyes directly. I couldn't track where that somewhere else is. Whoever set up the next layer of transfers knew what they were doing. But the pattern suggests offshore accounts, probably tax shelters in the Caribbean or Switzerland. I sat back in my chair, the coffee forgotten, my mind racing through the implications of what David was telling me. Victoria had taken out over $1 million against my family's ancestral home, the property my great-great-grandfather had built when he first came to Oregon in the late 1800s, the land my grandmother had loved and tended and wanted preserved for future generations. She'd taken that legacy and turned it into a personal bank account, funding an elaborate wedding that was really a business transaction, paying off her future son-in-law for reasons I couldn't yet understand, and hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in accounts that couldn't be traced or taxed or discovered by anyone asking inconvenient questions. "There's one more thing," David said, and his voice had dropped even lower, barely audible over the espresso machine hissing behind the counter. The loan application required multiple signatures because Thornwood is technically held in a family trust. Your grandfather set it up that way to protect the estate from being sold or mortgaged without consensus. It requires signatures from the primary trustee and any direct descendants who are beneficiaries. He pulled out one final document, and I recognized it immediately. A loan agreement, official and notarized, with 3 signatures at the bottom. Richard Harper, primary trustee. Victoria Harper, co-trustee. And in careful, slightly slanted handwriting that looked almost exactly like mine, Natalie Harper, beneficiary. The world seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. I reached out and touched the signature, tracing the loops and angles of letters I had definitely not written, on a document I had never seen, authorizing debt against a property I'd been trying to distance myself from for 6 years. "That's not my signature," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I could see how close it was, how someone who didn't know my handwriting intimately might not notice the subtle differences. The way my real signature flattened slightly on the second, and Natalie, a quirk from the way I'd broken my right wrist as a teenager and had to relearn how to write. The way my R usually looped back on itself more tightly than this one did. Small differences, almost invisible, but they're nonetheless. "I know it's not," David said gently. "I've seen your signature on enough birthday cards over the years to recognize this as a forgery. The question is whether you can prove it, and whether proving it will make things better or worse." He leaned back, rubbing his hand across his face in a gesture of exhaustion. "Victoria's smart, Natalie. She's been planning this for a long time, covering her tracks, making sure everything looks legitimate on the surface. If you go to the authorities now, you'll be accusing your stepmother of fraud and forgery, which will trigger investigations into the family business, possibly destroy Cassidy's wedding, definitely create a scandal that will follow the Harper name for years. Your father will be implicated even if he didn't actively participate, because he signed those papers as primary trustee. The vineyard could be seized as part of a criminal investigation. Everything your family has built could collapse." "Good," I said, the word coming out harder than I intended. "Let it collapse. They've been building on a foundation of lies anyway." But even as I spoke, I thought about Cassidy, about whether she knew what Victoria had done, about whether my sister was a willing participant in this fraud or just another victim of our stepmother's manipulations. I thought about my father, weak and distant and complicit through his silence, but still the man who had taught me how to identify different types of clay by touch, who had once cared about something beyond whatever story Victoria told him to believe. David was watching me carefully, reading the conflict on my face. "I'm not telling you what to do, Natalie. I'm just making sure you understand what you're walking into if you decide to fight this. Victoria has resources, connections, and apparently no moral boundaries when it comes to protecting her version of the Harper legacy. She's already proven she's willing to forge your signature and steal from you. What else might she be willing to do if you threaten to expose her?" It was a fair question and one I didn't have a good answer for. The woman who had raised me from age 12, who had married my father 2 years after my mother died and immediately set about transforming Thornwood Manor from a comfortable family home into a showpiece for entertaining, who had always made me feel like I was taking up space that belonged to someone more deserving. Had I ever really known what she was capable of? I thought back to the years after she married my father, how gradually and systematically she had erased my mother's presence from the house. Photos that disappeared from walls. Furniture that was suddenly too shabby and needed replacing. My mother's garden, which she had spent years cultivating with native Oregon plants and wildflowers, plowed under and replaced with formal rose beds that required constant maintenance and looked beautiful but sterile. At the time, I'd thought it was just her way of making the space her own, of establishing her place in a home that held the ghost of another woman. Now I wondered if it had been practice for erasing me. "Can you make me a copy of all this?" I asked, gesturing to the documents spread across the table. David nodded and pulled out his phone, quickly photographing each page and sending them to my email. The soft ping of incoming messages felt like evidence accumulating, like power slowly shifting in my direction. When he finished, he gathered the papers back into the folder and held it for a moment, as if weighing whether to give it to me or keep it safe himself. "Be careful, Natalie," he said as he finally slid it across to me. "I've seen what happens to people who go up against someone like Victoria. She'll paint you as unstable, as jealous of your sister, as someone with a grudge who's willing to lie and fabricate evidence to hurt the family. She'll use every weapon she has, and she has a lot of them." He finished his coffee, now cold, and grimaced. "But if anyone can stand up to her, it's you. You're the only person in that family who ever learned to stand on your own without needing Thornwood to define you." After David left, I sat alone in the grinding stone for another hour, watching the afternoon light change outside and feeling the weight of the folder in my bag like a stone I'd chosen to carry. The coffee shop had filled with the after-work crowd, people meeting friends for happy hour, couples on early dates, groups of coworkers decompressing after long days at offices downtown. Normal people living normal lives where family meant safety instead of strategy, where homes were built on foundations that didn't shift and crack beneath you. I ordered another coffee. I didn't really want just to have an excuse to stay, to sit in the noise and warmth and ordinariness of other people's uncomplicated relationships, while I tried to figure out what came next. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Torres, my friend who worked as an investigative journalist for the Willamette Week. We'd met 3 years ago when she'd done a feature on local artisans and had spent an afternoon in my studio, photographing me at the wheel and asking questions about why I'd chosen pottery instead of following my family into the wine business. She'd understood without me having to explain that sometimes making beautiful things with your hands was the only way to feel clean when everything else in your life was stained with compromise and pretense. The text was simple, just checking in the way she did every few weeks, asking if I wanted to grab dinner soon, nothing urgent or demanding. But looking at her name on my screen, I realized she might be exactly who I needed right now. I called instead of texting back. She answered with the sound of a busy newsroom in the background, phones ringing and people talking over each other in that particular chaos of deadline pressure. "Natalie, hey, hang on one second." The background noise faded as she presumably stepped into a quieter space. "Sorry, it's insane here today. Some city council scandal breaking." "What's up? Are you still investigating financial fraud in the wine industry?" I asked, remembering a series of articles she published last year about vineyard owners who were inflating their property values and taking out fraudulent loans against the inflated assessments. The pieces had won her some kind of regional journalism award and had resulted in 3 criminal investigations. Rachel had a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and impossible to intimidate, qualities that had made her enemies among Oregon's agricultural elite, but had also made her one of the most respected investigative reporters in the state. There was a pause on her end, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted from casual friend to professional journalist. "Why? What did you hear?" I could picture her already reaching for a notebook, that instinct for story kicking in the way mine did when I saw a piece of damaged pottery that might be worth restoring. "Not heard. Found. Can we meet? Somewhere private, not your office." Another pause, longer this time, while she calculated what I might be offering and whether it was worth rearranging her evening. "How serious are we talking? Over $1 million in potentially fraudulent loans, forged signatures, shell companies, and a wedding that might be a cover for money laundering serious," I said quietly, aware that even in the coffee shop's noise, these were words that could carry consequences. "And it involves my family." I heard her sharp intake of breath, then a string of Spanish that I'd learned over the years usually meant she was both excited and stressed about a potential story. "My place. 7 tonight. Bring everything you have." She hung up before I could respond, which was very Rachel, already shifting into work mode. already planning how to approach the story, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I left the grinding stone as the sun was starting to set behind the West Hills, turning the city golden and soft in that particular way that made Portland feel like a watercolor painting, all blurred edges and gentle light. The drive back to my studio took me through neighborhoods I'd come to love over the past 6 years. The tree-lined streets of Northwest Portland, the industrial edges of the Pearl District where old warehouses had been converted into lofts and galleries and creative spaces. This was the life I'd built for myself, far enough from Thornwood that I could breathe but close enough that I could still smell the valley's grapes ripening in late summer when the wind blew right. My studio felt different when I walked back in, smaller somehow, as if the information I was carrying had taken up physical space and pushed against the walls. The half-finished bowl still sat on the wheel where I'd abandoned it days ago, the clay dried and cracked beyond saving. I picked it up and felt it crumble in my hands, turning back into dust and fragments. Some things couldn't be restored once they'd been left too long, once the damage had set in too deep. I wondered if my family was like that bowl, if we'd crossed some invisible line where repair was no longer possible and all that was left was to let the pieces fall where they would. But then I thought about my grandmother's vase, the Ming-style porcelain that had sat in Thornwood's entrance hall for as long as I could remember, the piece she'd acquired on a trip to San Francisco in the 1960s and had treasured above all her other possessions. It was supposedly worth $30,000, though she'd always said its real value had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what it represented. Endurance. Beauty that survived across centuries. The idea that fragile things could be strong if they were made right and treated with care. Victoria had always hated that vase, had called it ostentatious and out of place in Thornwood's more understated aesthetic. I wondered if it was still there, or if Victoria had finally found an excuse to get rid of it the way she'd gotten rid of everything else that connected the manor to the people who'd built it. Rachel's apartment was in the Hawthorne district, a third-floor walk-up above a vintage bookstore that smelled perpetually of old paper and coffee. I climbed the narrow stairs with the folder tucked under my arm, passing walls covered in framed protest posters from the 60s and 70s, remnants of the building's history as a hub for Portland's counterculture movement. Rachel had lived here for 5 years, claiming the rent was cheap enough that she could afford to take on investigative projects that didn't pay well, but mattered more than the commercial assignments editors kept trying to push on her. She opened the door before I could knock, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, reading glasses perched on top of her head, wearing the same outfit she probably wore to the office that morning except now the blazer was gone and her sleeves were rolled up. Her apartment was exactly what you'd expect from an investigative journalist, organized chaos with stacks of newspapers and file folders covering every surface, a corkboard taking up one entire wall with photos and articles pinned in patterns that probably made sense to her, but looked like beautiful madness to everyone else. The smell of something spicy and warm came from the kitchen, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since the coffee shop. "I made chicken tortilla soup," she said by way of greeting, pulling me inside and closing the door firmly behind me. "You look like you haven't had a real meal in days, and we're going to be here a while, so you might as well eat something that isn't coffee and anxiety." She wasn't wrong. I followed her to the small kitchen table, which she'd already cleared of its usual debris and set with 2 bowls and a basket of tortilla chips. We ate in silence for a few minutes while I tried to organize my thoughts into something coherent, some narrative that would make sense of the tangle of fraud and family dysfunction I was about to lay at her feet. The soup was perfect, spicy and comforting, the kind of food that reminded you that people could still care about each other in simple, uncomplicated ways. Rachel watched me eat with the patience of someone who'd learned that rushing sources never produce good information, that sometimes the most important parts of a story emerged in the silences between words. When I finally pushed the empty bowl away and wiped my mouth, she leaned forward with her elbows on the table and said simply, "Start at the beginning. Don't leave anything out." So I told her everything. About seeing Cassidy's wedding photos online, and realizing I hadn't been invited. About calling my father and hearing the weakness in his voice, the way he'd let Victoria make decisions about which daughter deserved to exist in family narratives. About meeting David and learning that my signature had been forged on loan documents I'd never seen, that Victoria had borrowed over $1 million against Thornwood, and was moving money through shell companies in patterns that looked exactly like the fraud schemes Rachel had exposed in her previous investigations. I pulled out the folder and spread the documents across her kitchen table, watching her eyes sharpen as she scanned the loan applications and wire transfer records in corporate filings. She asked questions with surgical precision, clarifying dates and dollar amounts, making me walk through exactly how David had obtained the information, and whether he'd be willing to serve as a source if the story went to publication. I explained that he was nervous about professional repercussions, that Victoria had enough influence in Oregon's financial community to make his life difficult if she wanted to, but that he'd agreed to provide documentation as long as his name stayed protected. Rachel nodded, making notes in the small leather notebook she always carried, her handwriting cramped and efficient. "This shell company, Heritage Restoration Consulting," she said, tapping the page with her pen. "That name is deliberately chosen to sound connected to your family's history with Thornwood. Anyone doing surface-level research would assume it's a legitimate business related to maintaining historic properties. But there's no web presence, no business license filed with the state beyond the basic LLC registration, nothing." She pulled out her laptop and started typing rapidly, pulling up databases I didn't have access to, following digital trails that most people didn't know existed. "The registered agent is a law firm in Lake Oswego, Whitmore and Associates. They specialize in estate planning and asset protection for high-net-worth individuals. Very discreet, very expensive, and they have a reputation for helping clients navigate the gray areas of tax law." I watched her work, fingers flying across the keyboard, windows opening and closing as she cross-referenced information across multiple sources. This was Rachel in her element, following the money trail the way a hunter tracks prey through forest, patient and focused and utterly determined. After 20 minutes of searching, she sat back and rubbed her eyes under her glasses. "Okay, so here's what I can confirm with public records. Victoria created Heritage Restoration Consulting 8 months ago, right around the time she moved your family's accounts away from David's bank. The company has no employees, no tax returns filed yet because it's still within the first-year window, and no actual business operations that I can find. But it does have a business bank account at Columbia River Credit Union, and between January and April of this year, that account received 4 wire transfers totaling $400,000 from the Thornwood Manor refinancing loan." "And after that?" I asked, leaning forward. "Where did the money go from there?" Rachel shook her head slowly. "That's where the trail goes cold. The account shows several large withdrawals and transfers, but they're coded in a way that suggests international transactions. Without a subpoena or cooperation from the credit union, I can't trace them further. But the pattern is consistent with money being moved offshore, probably to countries with strict banking privacy laws. Switzerland, Cayman Islands, maybe Singapore. Places where it's very difficult for U.S. authorities to follow the money without significant legal resources." The implications settled over me like a weight. Victoria hadn't just borrowed against Thornwood to fund Cassidy's extravagant wedding. She created an entire infrastructure for moving and hiding money, for building wealth in places where it couldn't be touched by taxes or investigations or family members who might ask inconvenient questions about where their inheritance had gone. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, a moment of weakness or a one-time bad decision. This was systematic, planned, the kind of operation that required research and professional help and a complete absence of conscience. "What about the payment to Fletcher Agricultural Holdings?" I asked, remembering the $200,000 that David had flagged as suspicious. Why would Victoria pay Owen Fletcher's company a consulting fee right before he marries into the family? Rachel pulled up a new search, typing Owen Fletcher's name into several databases. His face appeared in multiple results, clean-cut and conventionally handsome, the kind of person who looked trustworthy in the automatic way that made him dangerous. Articles from agricultural trade publications described him as an innovator in sustainable farming practices, a young executive taking over his family's operation and expanding it into new markets. His LinkedIn profile was impressive: Stanford MBA, previous experience at a venture capital firm in San Francisco, currently serving as CEO of Fletcher Agricultural Holdings with ambitions to create a vertically integrated wine production and distribution network. "He looks perfect on paper," Rachel murmured, scrolling through his professional history. "Too perfect, actually. Like someone designed him in a lab to appeal to families like yours." She clicked on the Fletcher Agricultural Holdings website, which showcased their various properties across Oregon and Washington, their investments in organic farming technology, their partnerships with restaurants and distributors throughout the Pacific Northwest. Everything looked legitimate and successful, the kind of operation that should have no trouble funding its own expansion without needing $200,000 from a future in-law. But then Rachel pulled up the company's financial filings with the Oregon Secretary of State, documents that publicly traded or investor-backed companies had to submit annually. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the numbers. Interesting. Fletcher Agricultural Holdings took on significant debt 18 months ago, about the same time Owen started dating your sister. They borrowed heavily to acquire 2 additional vineyard properties in Washington, betting that they could increase production and capture more market share. But the expansion hasn't performed as projected. Their last quarterly filing shows revenue below expectations and debt service consuming most of their operating capital. So they're struggling financially, I said, understanding beginning to crystallize. And a merger with Harper Family Vineyards would give them access to Thornwood's reputation and distribution network, plus whatever additional capital Victoria can extract from the estate. Rachel nodded grimly. And that $200,000 consulting fee? I'd bet anything that was actually a payment to incentivize Owen to move forward with the marriage despite whatever reservations he might have about joining a family that's clearly engaged in financial fraud. It's buying his silence, basically, or maybe his participation in whatever larger scheme Victoria's building. The soup had gone cold in my stomach, curdling into something sour and heavy. I thought about Cassidy, my sister who had always been Victoria's favorite, who had learned from an early age how to smile at the right moments and say the right things and never ask questions that might disturb the carefully constructed surface of our family's life. Did she know what she was marrying into? Had Victoria told her that Owen was being paid to become her husband, that the romance and the proposal and the elaborate wedding were all just components of a business transaction dressed up in white lace and promises? Or was Cassidy as much a victim of Victoria's manipulations as I was, just deployed differently, used as an asset instead of erased as an inconvenience? Rachel was watching me with an expression that mixed professional interest with genuine concern. We'd known each other long enough that she could read the conflict on my face, the way I was torn between the desire to expose Victoria's crimes and the worry about what that exposure would cost everyone connected to Thornwood Manor. "What are you thinking?" she asked gently. "Are you having second thoughts about pursuing this?" I shook my head, but the movement felt uncertain even to me. "I'm thinking about Cassidy, about whether she knows what Victoria's done, whether she's part of it or just another piece being moved around Victoria's chessboard." I met Rachel's eyes. "If we expose this, if you publish a story about fraud and forged signatures and money laundering, it destroys the wedding. It probably destroys Cassidy's relationship with Owen, assuming he's the kind of person who runs when things get complicated. It definitely destroys any chance of my sister and I ever having a normal relationship again. Not that we really have one now. But if you don't expose it," Rachel countered quietly, "Victoria keeps stealing from you, keeps using your name and your grandmother's legacy to fund whatever scheme she's running. She gets away with fraud because you're worried about protecting people who haven't done anything to protect you." It was a fair point and one I couldn't really argue with. Still, the weight of the decision felt crushing. I stood up from the table and walked to Rachel's window, looking out over Hawthorne Boulevard where evening shoppers wandered between boutiques and restaurants, where food carts were doing brisk business selling Korean tacos and artisan ice cream, where the city hummed with uncomplicated Friday night energy. "Can I ask you something?" I said without turning around. "In all the investigations you've done, all the fraud cases you've exposed, do the families ever survive intact? Do the relationships ever recover once the truth comes out?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her moving around the kitchen, probably clearing the dishes and giving herself time to formulate an honest answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but unflinching. "No, not really. The families that end up in my stories are usually already broken. They just haven't admitted it yet. The fraud is a symptom, not the cause. By the time someone's forging signatures and hiding money offshore, the trust is already gone. Exposing it just makes visible what was already true." I turned back to face her, leaning against the windowsill. "So what you're saying is that my family is already destroyed, and I'm just deciding whether to acknowledge it or keep pretending." She nodded slowly. "I'm saying that Victoria made choices that broke your family years ago, probably starting from the moment she married your father. You didn't cause this, Natalie. You're just the first person honest enough to stop ignoring it. She crossed to her corkboard and pinned up some of the documents I'd brought, starting to build the visual map she always created when working on a complex story. The question isn't whether you're going to hurt your family by pursuing this. The question is whether you're going to keep letting them hurt you by staying silent. We worked late into the night, Rachel asking detailed questions about Thornwood's history and my grandmother's original intentions for the estate, me trying to remember specific conversations and documents I'd seen over the years that might corroborate the pattern of financial manipulation we were uncovering. She explained that to make the story publishable, she needed more than just the loan documents David had provided. She needed evidence of where the money had gone after it left Heritage Restoration Consulting's account, proof that Victoria had intentionally created the shell company to hide assets rather than for some legitimate business purpose, and ideally some kind of direct statement from Victoria herself that would demonstrate her awareness of the fraud. What you have right now is strong circumstantial evidence, Rachel explained, updating her notes. It's enough to raise serious questions and probably trigger an investigation if you went to law enforcement. But for me to publish a story that will have real impact, that will put enough public pressure on authorities to act quickly, I need to build an airtight case. Otherwise, Victoria's lawyers will tear it apart, claim everything was a misunderstanding or a clerical error, and by the time the truth comes out, everyone will have moved on to the next scandal. She tapped her pen against her notebook. We need more. We need to get inside Thornwood, see what other documents might exist, maybe record Victoria talking about the scheme if we can create a situation where she feels safe being honest. The idea of returning to Thornwood, of walking back into that house where I'd spent so much of my childhood feeling like an outsider in my own family, made my chest tight with anxiety. But Rachel was right. If I wanted to stop Victoria, if I wanted to protect whatever remained of my grandmother's legacy and prevent my stepmother from draining Thornwood of everything valuable before disappearing to whatever offshore paradise she'd been planning, I needed to stop watching from a distance and step back into the center of the conflict I'd been avoiding for 6 years. The wedding is this Saturday, I said slowly, thinking out loud. That's 8 days from now. There's probably chaos at Thornwood right now, last-minute preparations, vendors coming and going, everyone focused on making sure Cassidy's big day goes perfectly. Victoria would be distracted, spread thin trying to manage all the details. Rachel's eyes lit up with understanding. And if you showed up unexpectedly, claiming you wanted to reconcile with the family before the wedding, she might let her guard down enough to say something incriminating. Especially if she thinks you're there to apologize or make peace, if she believes you're not a threat. The plan took shape between us over the next hour. Fueled by tea that Rachel kept making, and the kind of focused energy that comes from knowing you're building something important. I would drive to Thornwood Manor tomorrow morning, Saturday, exactly 1 week before the wedding. I'd arrive early enough that Victoria wouldn't have time to prepare a response, wouldn't have her usual armor of social performance fully in place. I'd tell her I'd seen the wedding photos online and realized I was being childish about the family tensions, that I wanted to be there for Cassidy's big day regardless of our complicated history. I'd offer to help with preparations, to make myself useful in whatever way would get me access to Victoria's office and the estate's financial records. And while I was there, while Victoria was distracted with caterers and florists and whatever last-minute emergencies always seem to emerge before big events, I'd look for evidence. Documents that showed where the offshore money was hidden. Communications between Victoria and Owen that revealed the nature of their arrangement. Anything that would prove the wedding was cover for fraud, and that my signature had been forged not through carelessness but through deliberate criminal intent. Rachel would stay in Portland, ready to receive whatever information I could send, prepared to start writing the story the moment we had enough confirmed facts to publish. This is dangerous, Rachel said as I was getting ready to leave, her journalist's excitement tempered by genuine concern for my safety. Not physically dangerous necessarily, though Victoria sounds unstable enough that I wouldn't rule it out. But emotionally dangerous. You're going back into an environment that hurt you for years, surrounded by people who've shown they don't value your well-being. You're going to have to perform trust and affection for a woman who's been stealing from you. That kind of cognitive dissonance does damage, even when you know you're doing it for good reasons. I pulled on my jacket, feeling the folder of documents in my bag like a talisman against the fear that was trying to take root in my chest. I know. But I've been running from Thornwood for 6 years, trying to build a life where my family couldn't touch me. And look where it got me. Victoria still found a way to use me, to steal from me, to make me complicit in her schemes without my knowledge or consent. I met Rachel's eyes. I'm tired of being a victim of my family's dysfunction. I want to be the person who stopped it, even if that comes with costs I can't fully predict yet. She pulled me into a tight hug, the kind that said more than words about friendship and solidarity, and the acknowledgement that sometimes the right choice was also the hard one. When she let go, she pressed a small device into my hand, about the size of a USB drive, but with a tiny clip on one side. Voice recorder. 8-hour battery life, sound activated so it only records when people are talking. Clip it somewhere on your clothes where it won't be obvious, maybe inside a shirt pocket or on a belt loop under your jacket. If Victoria says anything about the fraud, anything that confirms she knew what she was doing, we'll have it on tape. I looked down at the small device, black and innocuous, capable of capturing the kind of truth that could send someone to prison or destroy a family's reputation or finally, after years of silence, prove that I hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or wrong about the rot beneath Thornwood's polished surface. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility it represented. Tomorrow morning, I would drive back to the place I'd spent 6 years trying to forget, walk into rooms that held memories of every time I'd felt small and wrong and unwanted, and face the woman who had spent 15 years remaking my family in her own image. I would smile and apologize and pretend to be someone I wasn't, all in service of exposing the truth that would set me free even as it destroyed what remained of my family's carefully constructed lies. The drive back to my studio took me through empty streets, Portland settling into its weekend rhythm. The bridges over the Willamette River lit up in colors that reflected off the dark water like drowned rainbows. I thought about my grandmother Eleanor, about how she used to say that clay had memory, that it remembered every hand that shaped it and every fire that hardened it into its final form. She said that was why pottery could survive centuries, why archaeologists found ancient vessels intact when everything else had crumbled to dust. Because the clay remembered its strength, remembered the hands that had shaped it with intention and care, and that memory became permanence. I wondered what memories Thornwood Manor held in its walls and floors and foundations, whether the house remembered my mother, who had loved it before Victoria arrived and tried to erase her, whether it remembered my grandmother, whose vision for the estate had been preservation and honest stewardship rather than profit and performance, whether it remembered me as a child, running through those rooms before I learned that families could be just as good at destroying as at creating, that the people who should protect you could choose instead to use you. Tomorrow I would find out if houses could remember, if truth could be recovered from beneath layers of lies, if something broken could be restored not to what it had been but to what it should have been all along. I parked behind my studio and sat for a moment in the darkness, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, feeling the recorder in my pocket like a promise I was making to the girl I used to be, the one who had believed her family when they told her she was the problem. Tomorrow I would stop believing them. Tomorrow I would start proving them wrong. The drive to Thornwood Manor took just under an hour, the morning fog lifting as I left Portland's city limits and headed south into wine country. The landscape shifted gradually from urban density to rolling hills covered in orderly rows of grapevines, their leaves just beginning to show the deep green of late spring growth. I'd made this drive hundreds of times in my life, knew every curve and landmark, could anticipate the exact moment when Mount Hood would appear in the rearview mirror, and when the Willamette River would curve close enough to the road that you could see sunlight dancing on its surface. But today everything felt different, charged with the electricity of intention and risk, as if the familiar route had transformed into something dangerous simply because I was choosing to travel it with purpose rather than obligation. The recorder Rachel had given me was clipped inside my shirt pocket, its small weight pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. I tested it that morning in my studio, playing back my own voice saying mundane things about pottery and weather, making sure I understood how to activate it and how much sound it could pick up from a concealed position. The technology was better than I'd expected, sensitive enough to capture normal conversation from several feet away, smart enough to filter out ambient noise and focus on voices. If Victoria said anything incriminating today, anything that confirmed her knowledge of the fraud or revealed where the hidden money had gone, this small device would preserve it in a format that couldn't be denied or explained away. Thornwood's gates appeared ahead, wrought iron twisted into elaborate patterns of grapevines and oak leaves. The Harper family crest mounted at the center where the two sides met. Someone had decorated them with white ribbons and early blooming roses, wedding preparations already visible even at the property's entrance. I slowed the car and turned into the long driveway, gravel crunching under my tires, oak trees forming a canopy overhead that filtered the morning light into patterns of gold and shadow. The house came into view gradually the way it always did, white columns first, then the sprawling wings that had been added over generations, finally the full scope of the estate revealing itself like a stage set prepared for performance. There were cars parked everywhere, vehicles I didn't recognize belonging to vendors and event staff. A catering truck backed up to the kitchen entrance, florist vans unloading massive arrangements of white peonies and garden roses. People moved with purposeful efficiency across the lawn, setting up tent poles and running electrical cables, transforming Thornwood's grounds into whatever vision Victoria had designed for Cassidy's perfect day. I parked away from the main cluster of vehicles, giving myself a moment to steady my breathing and check my appearance in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, my clothes deliberately casual to suggest I'd come on impulse rather than planning. The goal was to appear non-threatening, apologetic, someone who wanted reconciliation rather than confrontation. I walked toward the front entrance, my legs carrying me through movements I performed thousands of times but which now felt strange and unfamiliar, as if I were an actor walking onto a stage where I'd once performed but had forgotten my lines. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't surprising given the number of people coming and going, and I stepped into the entrance hall that had always been the heart of Thornwood Manor. The space was exactly as I remembered and completely transformed at the same time. The bones of it unchanged but every surface covered in wedding preparations. Sample place settings covered the dining table visible through the archway to my right, fabric swatches in various shades of ivory and cream draped over chairs, a mood board propped against one wall showing what I assumed was the vision for how everything would look when assembled. And there, still in its place of honor on the antique console table near the staircase, sat my grandmother's Ming-style vase. The porcelain gleamed in the morning light streaming through the tall windows, its blue and white pattern as delicate and precise as the day it had been made centuries ago. I'd half expected Victoria to have gotten rid of it by now, to have replaced it with something more aligned with her aesthetic preferences, but seeing it there created a complicated knot of emotion in my chest. Relief that it had survived, anger that Victoria got to keep treasuring it, while trying to erase everything else my grandmother had valued, and underneath both a deep sadness for what could have been if this family had chosen honesty over performance. Voices drifted from deeper in the house, multiple conversations happening simultaneously in that particular chaos that precedes big events. I followed the sound toward the back of the manor, through the formal living room where more wedding paraphernalia was scattered across every surface, past my father's study where the door stood open to reveal an empty room, and finally to the sunroom that overlooked the vineyard where I found Victoria holding court with what appeared to be the wedding planner and several assistants. She saw me before I could announce my presence, her head turning with that predatory awareness she'd always had for knowing when someone entered her territory. For a moment her face registered pure shock, the careful mask of control slipping to reveal something raw and unguarded beneath. Then, so quickly I almost might have imagined the lapse, her expression smoothed into polite confusion edged with annoyance. She held up one finger to the wedding planner, a gesture that said wait, and moved toward me with the kind of deliberate grace that always made me feel clumsy and wrong by comparison. Natalie. My name in her mouth sounded like an accusation. This is unexpected. I wasn't aware you planned to visit. She didn't move to hug me or offer any of the physical affection that would have been normal between a stepmother and daughter who hadn't seen each other in over a year. Instead, she stood at a careful distance, her posture defensive, her eyes scanning me as if trying to determine whether I was there to cause problems or could be managed into compliance with whatever story she needed to maintain. I'd practiced this part, rehearsed the words that would make me seem harmless and apologetic rather than angry and investigating. The recorder was running now. I'd activated it in the car, capturing every word that passed between us. I saw the wedding photos online, I said, letting my voice carry just enough hurt to be believable. And I realized I was being stubborn and selfish about family tensions that don't really matter in the bigger picture. Cassidy's getting married, and I should be here for that regardless of our complicated history. I met Victoria's eyes, forcing myself to hold her gaze. I came to apologize for being difficult, and to see if there's anything I can do to help this week. I know you must be overwhelmed with preparations. Victoria's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to fully track: surprise and suspicion, and what might have been calculation as she weighed whether my sudden change of heart was genuine or a trap. Behind her, the wedding planner was checking her phone with the impatient air of someone whose time was being wasted, and I could see Victoria's attention split between managing this unexpected situation and maintaining control of all the other moving pieces demanding her focus. Finally, she seemed to reach some internal decision and her posture relaxed fractionally, her smile warming just enough to suggest she was accepting my explanation at face value. "That's very mature of you, Natalie," she said, and I hated how her approval still created a small flutter of response in my chest even though I knew it was manipulative and conditional and meaningless. "Cassidy will be touched that you want to be part of her special day. She's upstairs right now actually having her final dress fitting. Why don't you go up and see her? I'm sure she'd appreciate the support." It was a dismissal, a way to get me out of her space while she dealt with more important matters, but it was also an opportunity. If Cassidy was upstairs, that meant Victoria's office was likely unoccupied, and that was where any physical documents about the fraud would be kept. I nodded and moved toward the staircase, feeling Victoria's eyes on my back as I climbed. The second floor of Thornwood was quieter, insulated from the chaos below, the thick carpet and solid construction muffling sound in that particular way old houses had of creating pockets of silence. Cassidy's childhood bedroom was at the end of the hall, the door partially open, and I could hear female voices inside talking about hem lengths and alterations. I walked past it without stopping, my feet carrying me instead to the small room that Victoria had converted into a home office years ago, the space where she managed Thornwood's finances and the Harper family vineyard's business operations. The door was closed but not locked. I turned the handle slowly and stepped inside, closing it behind me with a soft click that sounded too loud in the quiet hallway. Victoria's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone obsessed with control and appearances. Everything organized with military precision, no papers scattered or coffee cups forgotten, just clean surfaces and labeled filing cabinets and a large desk with a computer monitor turned off and a leather chair positioned at the exact center of the workspace. I stood for a moment, my heart hammering, knowing that what I was about to do crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that searching through Victoria's private files without permission was probably illegal regardless of what those files might reveal. But then I thought about my forged signature on loan documents, about the $1 million borrowed against my grandmother's property without my knowledge or consent, about 6 years of being erased and excluded and treated as if my existence was an inconvenience to be managed. I thought about Cassidy downstairs having her dress fitted, probably unaware that her wedding was funded by fraud, and that her fiancé had been paid to marry her. And I thought about my grandmother Eleanor, who had loved this estate and wanted it preserved as a testament to family and legacy and honest work, who would be heartbroken to know what Victoria had turned it into. I moved to the filing cabinets first, pulling open drawers and scanning labels that seemed innocuously financial. Tax returns, vendor contracts, payroll records, insurance policies, everything organized alphabetically and chronologically, in a way that suggested Victoria was meticulous about maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. I photographed several documents with my phone, not entirely sure what would be useful but operating on the principle that more information was better than less. In the third drawer, I found a folder labeled estate planning that contained copies of my grandmother's original will alongside the revised version that had mysteriously appeared after her death. I pulled both documents out and laid them side by side on the desk, photographing them together so the differences would be obvious. The original will, handwritten in my grandmother's shaky script during the last months of her life, was explicit in its intentions. Thornwood Manor and the surrounding vineyard property were to pass to me, Natalie Harper, in recognition of my commitment to preservation and historical stewardship. A cash bequest of $200,000 would go to Cassidy, and my father would retain lifetime residency rights but no ownership stake. Victoria wasn't mentioned anywhere in the document, which made sense given that she'd only married into the family and had no blood connection to the Harper legacy. The revised will, supposedly written several months before my grandmother's death and superseding the handwritten version, told a completely different story. It named Victoria as primary beneficiary of both the property and the family business, with smaller cash bequests to both Cassidy and myself, and gave my father only advisory input on estate decisions rather than any real authority. The signature at the bottom looked like my grandmother's, the same elaborate loops and careful formation of letters, but I remembered what David had said about the loan documents and my own forged signature. Victoria clearly had access to someone skilled at forgery, someone who could replicate handwriting well enough to fool lawyers and notaries and family members who wanted to believe the documents were legitimate. I was photographing the wills when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, someone approaching rather than passing by. I froze, phone in hand, documents spread across Victoria's desk, completely exposed if someone opened the door. The footsteps stopped right outside the office. The door handle turned, and I had perhaps 2 seconds to decide whether to try to hide or pretend I had a legitimate reason for being there. Neither option particularly believable given the evidence of my snooping laid out in plain sight. The door opened to reveal my father, Richard Harper, looking older and more worn than I remembered. His face registered surprise when he saw me, then something that might have been pain or regret or simply exhaustion. He glanced at the documents on the desk, at my phone still held in position to photograph them, and understanding settled over his features like a shadow. We stared at each other for a long moment, the silence heavy with all the years of things left unsaid, all the times he'd chosen the easy path of going along with Victoria rather than the harder path of protecting his daughters. "Natalie," he said finally, his voice rough as if he hadn't used it properly in a long time. "You shouldn't be in here." It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact, an acknowledgement that I was doing something dangerous that could have consequences neither of us wanted to face. I straightened, leaving the documents where they were, no longer bothering to pretend I had innocent intentions. "Someone needs to be," I replied quietly. "Someone needs to look at what Victoria's done to this family, to grandmother's legacy, to all of us." He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, and I noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way he seemed to have shrunk into himself over the years I'd been away. This was the man who had taught me how to identify soil types and prune grapevines, who had once been passionate about sustainable farming and historical preservation, who had married my mother because she shared his love of Thornwood and everything it represented. Somewhere along the way, that man had been replaced by this hollow version, animated by Victoria's will rather than his own. "I know what she's done," he said, and the admission hung in the air between us like smoke. "The forged wills, the offshore accounts, using your name on loan documents you never signed. I know all of it." My breath caught. This was what Rachel needed. Confirmation that the fraud wasn't accidental or misunderstood but deliberate and known. But hearing it from my father, seeing the defeat in his eyes as he admitted his complicity through silence, created a pain in my chest that had nothing to do with evidence or investigation and everything to do with the death of whatever small hope I'd still been carrying that he might be worth salvaging. "Then why haven't you stopped her?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. "Why have you let her steal from me? Forge grandmother's will, destroy everything this estate was supposed to represent?" He moved to the window that overlooked the vineyard, his back to me, his shoulders slumped under the weight of choices he couldn't undo. "Because stopping her would mean admitting I was part of it," he said to the glass. "Would mean acknowledging that I've known for years and did nothing. Would mean facing consequences I'm not brave enough to face. So you sacrificed me instead," I said flatly. "Made me the collateral damage in Victoria's schemes because that was easier than finding your spine." He flinched at the cruelty in my voice but didn't turn around, didn't defend himself or offer excuses that might have made his cowardice more palatable. Outside, the vineyard stretched toward the horizon in perfect rows. The vines my great-great-grandfather had planted and my grandmother had tended and my father had allowed to be used as collateral for fraud. Legacy measured in debt and deception rather than the honest stewardship that was supposed to pass from generation to generation. I gathered the documents from the desk and added them to my bag, no longer concerned about hiding what I was doing or pretending to have legitimate access to Victoria's files. My father knew what I was taking and why, and his silence was permission even if he'd never explicitly grant it. "I'm going to expose what Victoria's done," I said to his back. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows about the fraud and the forged signatures and the money she's hidden offshore. It's going to destroy Cassidy's wedding, Probably destroy the family business. Definitely destroy any illusion that the Harpers are anything other than another wealthy family built on lies. I know, he said quietly, still facing the window. I've known since you walked back into this house that's what you came to do. I could see it in your eyes, that same determination your grandmother had when she decided something mattered more than peace. He finally turned to face me, and I saw tears tracking down his face, silent and seemingly unconscious. Do what you need to do, Natalie. Maybe it's the only thing that will finally make this all stop. I left him standing in Victoria's office, left him with his tears and his regrets and the consequences of years of choosing comfort over courage. The hallway was still empty, still quiet, the chaos of wedding preparations contained to other parts of the house. I walked past Cassidy's room where feminine voices still discussed dress alterations and flowers, and whatever other details consumed a bride a week before her wedding. Part of me wanted to go in there, wanted to tell my sister what I'd learned and give her the chance to make an informed decision about whether to marry a man who'd been paid to propose. But I also knew that information would be wasted on someone who had spent her whole life learning to ignore uncomfortable truths in favor of maintaining the pretty fiction Victoria had constructed for her. The sunroom where I'd left Victoria was empty when I passed it, the wedding planner and her assistants having moved on to some other part of the estate that needed their attention. I could hear Victoria's voice drifting from the kitchen, giving instructions to caterers about food presentation and timing, her tone commanding and confident, the voice of someone who believed she controlled every variable and had contingency plans for anything unexpected that might arise. She had no idea that her carefully constructed empire was already beginning to crumble, that documents proving her fraud were already on their way to a journalist who would make them public, that the daughter she'd spent years erasing had finally become visible in the most dangerous possible way. I was almost to the front door, almost free of Thornwood and the weight of memories that tried to pull me back into old patterns of submission and silence, when I heard my name spoken in a voice I hadn't heard in over a year. Cassidy stood at the top of the staircase, still wearing what I assumed was her wedding dress, a confection of ivory silk and delicate lace that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. She looked beautiful and fragile, like one of my grandmother's porcelain pieces, lovely and valuable and somehow hollow at the core. You came, she said, and there was something in her voice I couldn't quite identify, not joy or anger but something more complicated, something that suggested her feelings about my presence were as mixed as mine about being here. She descended the stairs slowly, careful with the dress and the heels she was wearing, and I waited at the bottom watching her approach. We hadn't spoken since the previous Christmas when she'd called me dramatic for walking out of Victoria's dinner party, when she'd accused me of making everything about myself and ruining what could have been a nice family holiday. She'd made it clear then that she'd chosen sides, that maintaining Victoria's approval was more important than maintaining any relationship with me. But looking at her now, seeing the careful way she held herself and the tightness around her smile, I wondered if the choice had cost her more than she'd expected. She reached the bottom of the stairs and we stood facing each other in the entrance hall, the wedding preparations scattered around us, the vase my grandmother had treasured sitting on its table between us like a symbol of everything beautiful and fragile that Victoria would destroy if it served her purposes. I saw the photos online, I said, the same explanation I'd given Victoria but somehow feeling more honest directed at my sister. I wanted to see you before the wedding, wanted to try to fix things between us if that's still possible. Cassidy studied my face with an intensity that reminded me of when we were children, before Victoria had taught her to see me as competition rather than family. Mom said you were jealous, she said slowly. Said you left because you couldn't handle me being successful, me having what you wanted. But that never felt true, even when I repeated it to other people. You never wanted any of this. She gestured around the entrance hall, at the grand staircase and the expensive art and the wedding paraphernalia that represented Victoria's vision of success. You wanted something smaller and real, something you made yourself rather than inherited. The assessment was so accurate and so unexpected that I felt tears threatening, the kind that come from being seen after years of invisibility. I wanted a family that was honest, I said quietly. I wanted parents who chose truth over performance, who loved their daughters for who we actually are rather than who they need us to be. I wanted what grandmother wanted for Thornwood, preservation of something real rather than construction of something false. I paused, weighing how much to say. How much truth my sister could handle a week before her wedding. Cassidy, do you know how Victoria paid for all this? Do you know where the money came from for the dress and the caterers and the venue and everything that's happening this week? Something flickered across her face, there and gone too quickly to fully read. But it looked like fear mixed with stubborn determination not to know, not to ask questions that might require her to make difficult choices. The vineyard is doing well, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The expansion with Fletcher Agricultural is bringing in new investment. Mom explained it all to me. She said it like a mantra, like words she'd been told to repeat until they became real through repetition alone. I realized then that she did know, or at least suspected, but had chosen willful ignorance because acknowledging the truth would mean walking away from the fairy tale wedding and the prestigious marriage and all the markers of success that Victoria had taught her to value above honesty. She forged documents to borrow money against Thornwood, I said gently, hating that I had to be the one to shatter her careful denial but knowing that silence had already caused too much damage to everyone in this family. She used my signature without permission, created shell companies to hide assets offshore, and paid Owen's company $200,000 in what she called consulting fees. Your wedding is funded by fraud, and your marriage is starting with a transaction where your husband was paid to propose. I watched the color drain from Cassidy's face, watched her grab the stair railing for support as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. You're lying, she whispered. But there was no conviction in the accusation, just desperate hope that I was wrong. You're jealous and bitter and you're trying to ruin this for me because you can't stand seeing me happy. The words sounded borrowed, Victoria's language in Cassidy's voice, a script my sister had been trained to recite whenever anyone threatened the illusion of Harper family perfection. But her eyes told a different story, showed that some part of her had always known something was wrong, had always felt the wrongness beneath Victoria's careful construction, but had been too afraid to look directly at it. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs I'd taken in Victoria's office, the two wills side by side showing how my grandmother's intentions had been rewritten, the loan documents with my forged signature, the shell company filings and wire transfer records that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. She looked at each image with growing horror, her hand trembling as she scrolled through the evidence of how thoroughly Victoria had manipulated everyone and everything to serve her own purposes. When she finished, she handed my phone back and turned away, pressing her hands to her face. I knew something felt wrong, she said after a long moment, her voice muffled by her palms. I knew Owen proposed too quickly, that the wedding timeline was rushed, that Mom was too insistent about everything being perfect. I knew and I ignored it because admitting it would mean everything I've built my identity around is false. She lowered her hands and turned back to me, tears creating tracks through her carefully applied makeup. What am I supposed to do now, Natalie? The wedding is in a week. Owen's family has already traveled here. We have 200 people coming. I've spent months planning every detail. How am I supposed to just walk away from all of it? The question hung between us, and I understood that this was the cost of truth, the moment when illusions shattered and people had to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable reality. I could have softened my answer, could have told her that maybe she was overreacting, that maybe there were explanations for everything that would let her keep moving forward with her wedding and her life. But that would have been choosing peace over honesty, would have been repeating the pattern that had allowed Victoria's fraud to flourish unchallenged for so long. You walk away because staying would make you complicit, I said gently. You walk away because sometimes the hardest choice is also the right one. And because the person you become by choosing courage matters more than the wedding you lose by choosing truth. Cassidy was sobbing now, quiet tears that shook her shoulders and made the expensive wedding dress seem suddenly ridiculous, costume jewelry and stage props when what was needed was something real and solid to hold on to. I moved to hug her, my arms coming around my sister for the first time in over a year, and felt her collapse against me with the kind of surrender that comes from finally admitting, you can't hold everything together through will and performance alone. We stood like that for a long time, two daughters of Richard Harper trying to figure out how to be family when the woman who should have taught them had instead taught them how to compete and hide and pretend. The sound of footsteps made us both turn. Victoria stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her expression cycling through shock and fury and calculation as she took in the scene of her two stepdaughters embracing, the wedding dress and the tears and whatever truth she could read in our postures. She moved toward us with swift purpose, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and I instinctively shifted to put myself between her and Cassidy even though I wasn't sure what I was protecting my sister from. Victoria's eyes locked on mine, and in them I saw something I'd never seen before. Not anger or disappointment but raw panic. The look of someone who realizes their control is slipping and doesn't know how to reclaim it. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "What poison have you been feeding Cassidy?" She reached for my sister, trying to pull her away from me, but Cassidy stepped back with a firmness that clearly surprised Victoria. "She showed me the truth," Cassidy said, her voice stronger than I expected given the tears still streaking her face. "She showed me the loan documents you forged with her signature, the shell companies you created, the money you've been hiding. She showed me that my wedding is funded by fraud and my fiancé was paid to propose." Victoria's face hardened into something cold and frightening, all pretense of maternal warmth evaporating to reveal the calculating strategist beneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said to Cassidy, but her eyes never left mine. "Your sister is mentally unstable. Always has been. Too much like her mother who couldn't handle reality without falling apart. She's jealous of what you have, jealous that I've given you opportunities she squandered, and she's trying to destroy your happiness because she has none of her own." The words were designed to wound, aimed at old insecurities she'd been cultivating in me since childhood, but they landed differently now that I understood the pattern, now that I recognized her manipulation for what it was. "I'm not mentally unstable," I said calmly, pulling the recorder from my pocket and holding it up where Victoria could see it. "I'm just done pretending that your version of reality is the only one that matters. This has been recording our conversation, Victoria. Everything you've said, everything Dad admitted upstairs in your office, all of it preserved in a format that can't be denied or explained away." I watched understanding and fear flicker across her face as she realized the extent of what I'd done, how thoroughly I'd documented the evidence of her crimes. For a moment I thought she might lunge for the recorder, might try to physically take it from me and destroy the evidence. But then her expression shifted again, smoothing into something almost like respect, the look of one chess player recognizing a well-executed move by an opponent. "You think you're so smart," she said quietly, dangerously. "You think exposing me will make you the hero of this story, will prove that you were right all along about what a terrible person I am. But you don't understand the full picture, don't know what I was protecting by doing what I did." "Protecting?" I repeated incredulously. "You've been stealing from me, forging documents, committing fraud on a massive scale. What were you possibly protecting other than your own greed and need for control?" Victoria laughed, a bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Your father was bankrupt when I married him, did you know that? His precious sustainable farming practices and his refusal to modernize the vineyard had driven Thornwood to the brink of foreclosure. I saved this estate, saved the Harper name, rebuilt everything from nothing while your father drank himself into uselessness and your grandmother held on to outdated ideas about family legacy that would have lost everything." She moved closer, her voice rising with the kind of self-righteousness that comes from people who've convinced themselves their crimes are justified. "I made Thornwood successful. I turned a failing family farm into a respected name in Oregon wine country. I gave your sister a future and a career and a marriage that will open doors your grandmother's precious pottery skills never could. And yes, I took what I needed to make that happen because I earned it by saving what everyone else was too weak or stupid to save themselves." Her eyes blazed with conviction, with the absolute certainty of someone who's rewritten history in their own mind until the villain becomes the hero. The front door opened behind us, and suddenly the entrance hall was full of people. Rachel Torres entered first, her camera out and recording, capturing everything. Behind her came two uniformed police officers and a man in a suit who introduced himself as Detective Morrison with the Oregon State Police Financial Crimes Unit. Victoria's face went white as she realized what was happening, that this wasn't just a family confrontation but an actual investigation, that I hadn't come alone or unprepared, but had brought the full weight of law enforcement and journalism to witness her confession. "Victoria Harper," Detective Morrison said formally, moving toward her with handcuffs visible at his belt. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent." The rest of the Miranda warning faded into background noise as I watched my stepmother, the woman who had controlled every aspect of Thornwood Manor for 15 years, finally face consequences she couldn't manipulate or explain away. She looked at me one last time as the detective cuffed her wrists, and in her expression I saw hatred mixed with something that might have been grudging respect. Acknowledgement that I'd beaten her at her own game of secrets and strategy. The wedding planner emerged from wherever she'd been working, saw the police, and immediately started making frantic phone calls to cancel vendors and notify guests. Cassidy collapsed into a chair, still wearing her wedding dress, sobbing with the kind of grief that comes from watching your entire life plan disintegrate in minutes. My father appeared at the top of the stairs, took in the scene, and simply nodded as if he'd been expecting this all along, as if some part of him was relieved to finally stop pretending. Rachel came to stand beside me, her camera still rolling, capturing everything for the story she would write that would make Victoria's crimes public, and ensure there was no chance of the truth being buried or minimized. "You did good," she said quietly, her hand finding mine and squeezing. This took courage. I watched as the police led Victoria out through the front door she'd entered as a bride 15 years ago, past the vase my grandmother had treasured, past all the symbols of the legacy she tried to steal. Thornwood Manor had survived 4 generations of Harpers, had witnessed births and deaths and marriages, and now this arrest. This public unraveling of secrets that had been rotting beneath its foundation for too long. Outside, through the open door, I could see the vineyard, stretching toward the horizon in the afternoon light. The vines my ancestors had planted still growing despite everything, still producing grapes that would become wine, still performing the patient work of transformation that couldn't be rushed or faked. That was the real Harper legacy. Not the fraud and manipulation, but the honest work of tending something over generations, of understanding that true preservation meant protecting what was real rather than constructing what looked impressive. I walked to the console table and picked up my grandmother's vase, feeling its weight in my hands, tracing the delicate pattern that had survived centuries. Tomorrow the story would break and the scandal would consume social media and local news cycles. Tomorrow Thornwood would have to reckon with the full extent of Victoria's crimes and figure out how to rebuild from the wreckage. Tomorrow, Cassidy would have to decide whether to cancel her wedding or somehow salvage a relationship that had been tainted by transaction from the start. But today, in this moment, I was simply a granddaughter holding a piece of family history that had outlasted the woman who tried to destroy it, understanding finally that some things were worth fighting for even when the fight cost everything. Rachel drove me back to Portland as sunset painted the valley in shades of amber and gold, the recorder safely in police custody along with all the other evidence I'd gathered. We didn't talk much during the drive, both exhausted from the adrenaline and emotion of the day, but her presence beside me felt like solidarity, like proof that truth-telling didn't have to be a solitary act. When we finally pulled up outside my studio, she turned to me with a tired smile. "I'm writing this tonight," she said. "It'll be published by morning. Are you ready for what comes next?" I looked at the vase still cradled in my lap, the only piece of Thornwood I'd taken with me when I left, the symbol of everything my grandmother had valued about family and legacy and honest preservation. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted, "but I know I'm done being silent. Whatever comes next, I'll face it as someone who chose truth even when it was harder than lies." I carried the vase up to my studio and placed it in the window where morning light would hit it, where its beauty could be visible to anyone passing by on the street below. Then I sat at my pottery wheel and began to work, my hands moving through familiar motions of sintering and shaping, creating something new from clay that had been scattered and formless just moments before. Outside, the city settled into its evening rhythm, lights coming on in windows, people finishing work and heading home to families that were hopefully less complicated than mine. My phone buzzed with messages from reporters who'd somehow already heard about Victoria's arrest, from distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly concerned about family reputation, from Cassidy asking if we could talk tomorrow when she'd had time to process everything. I ignored them all for now, focused instead on the bowl taking shape beneath my fingers, on the simple act of making something beautiful and functional and honest. By morning, Rachel's story would be everywhere, telling the world about Victoria Harper's systematic fraud, and the family she'd manipulated in pursuit of wealth and status. By morning, Thornwood Manor would be crawling with more police and probably reporters, every detail of our family's dysfunction laid bare for public consumption. By morning, my own life would change in ways I couldn't predict, transformed by the choice to expose truth, rather than protect reputation. But tonight, In the quiet of my studio with clay spinning beneath my hands and my grandmother's vase reflecting light in the window, I was simply someone who had survived the breaking and was learning how to build something real from the pieces. The bowl I was making cracked slightly near the rim, a stress fracture from where my pressure had been uneven. I could have thrown it away and started over, could have insisted on perfection. Instead, I left the crack visible, understanding that sometimes the flaws were what made something real, what gave it character and history, and the kind of beauty that came from surviving damage rather than avoiding it. Tomorrow would bring consequences and complications and probably regrets. But tonight, I was exactly who my grandmother had hoped I'd become. Someone who chose preservation of truth over construction of lies. Someone who understood that the hardest thing to restore was often the thing most worth saving. 6 months passed before I returned to Thornwood Manor, autumn bringing its particular magic to the Willamette Valley with leaves turning gold and crimson against impossibly blue skies. The estate had been transferred back to my name through a legal process that involved more paperwork and court appearances than I'd anticipated. But the judge had been clear in her ruling. Victoria's fraud had invalidated every document she'd touched, and my grandmother's original will, authenticated through handwriting analysis and witness testimony, was the only legally binding expression of Eleanor Harper's intentions. The property was mine now, along with all the complications and responsibilities that came with it. The vineyard had continued operating through the chaos, managed by the staff who'd been tending these vines long before Victoria arrived, and would probably continue long after the scandal faded from public memory. They'd adapted to uncertainty with the pragmatism of people who understood that grapevines didn't care about human drama, that the work of cultivation continued regardless of who held the deed, or what crimes had been committed in the manor house. I'd met with them several times over those 6 months, learning about harvest schedules and equipment needs and market trends, slowly accepting that I was responsible now for preserving not just a building but an entire ecosystem of land and labor that had sustained my family for generations. Victoria was awaiting trial, held without bail after the prosecution argued she was a flight risk, given the offshore accounts she'd established in countries without extradition treaties. My father had cooperated with investigators in exchange for immunity, his testimony providing details about the fraud scheme that Victoria would have preferred remained hidden. He'd moved out of Thornwood into a small apartment in Portland, and we'd started meeting for coffee once a week, awkward conversations where we tried to build something resembling a relationship from the rubble of what had come before. He'd never be the father I needed as a child, but he was trying to become someone honest, and I decided that effort deserved acknowledgement even if it couldn't erase years of failure. Cassidy had cancelled the wedding 3 days after Victoria's arrest, a decision that had required more courage than I'd given her credit for possessing. Owen Fletcher had disappeared back to his family's struggling agricultural operation, and the last I'd heard he was facing his own legal troubles related to the fraudulent consulting fees he'd accepted. My sister had moved into a condo in downtown Portland and was seeing a therapist twice a week, slowly unpacking the damage of growing up as Victoria's favorite, of learning that conditional love based on performance wasn't actually love at all. We'd started having lunch together every few weeks, careful conversations where we were both learning how to be sisters without the weight of competing for affection or approval that would never be freely given. Rachel's story had won her another journalism award, and had sparked investigations into similar fraud schemes at other historic estates throughout Oregon. She'd written a follow-up series about how wealth and reputation created conditions where financial crimes could flourish undetected, where family loyalty was weaponized to silence victims who might otherwise speak up. The articles had been picked up nationally, and suddenly Rachel was being recruited by larger publications, offered positions in New York and Washington that would have represented significant career advancement. She'd turned them all down, choosing to stay in Portland where she felt her work mattered more, where she could continue investigating the stories that powerful people preferred stayed buried. I'd kept teaching pottery classes and taking commission work, but I'd also started spending more time at Thornwood, slowly transforming the manor from Victoria's showpiece back into something that felt more like the home my grandmother had loved. I'd moved her old pottery wheel from storage into the sunroom, setting it up where morning light flooded through windows overlooking the vineyard. It felt right to work with clay in the same space where she'd worked decades ago, to feel connected to her hands and her vision through the shared language of creation. Some of my students had started making the drive from Portland for weekend workshops, drawn by the beauty of the valley and the story of how the estate had been reclaimed from fraud through a granddaughter's determination. The manor itself had revealed secrets during the months I'd spent preparing it for my permanent return. Hidden behind a false panel in what had been Victoria's office, I'd found a collection of documents my stepmother had clearly meant to destroy but hadn't quite managed before her arrest. Letters between her and Owen Fletcher discussing the terms of his payment and the expectations for the marriage. Correspondence with the lawyer who'd helped her establish the offshore accounts. Most damning, a handwritten ledger where she'd tracked every dollar stolen and every lie told, maintaining meticulous records of her own crimes as if she'd needed to prove to herself the scope of what she'd accomplished. I'd turned everything over to the prosecutors, and each new piece of evidence had strengthened the case against her until even Victoria's expensive lawyers had started suggesting she accept a plea deal rather than risk trial. The last update I'd received indicated she was facing somewhere between 7 and 12 years in federal prison, though the final sentencing wouldn't happen for several more months. Part of me felt satisfied knowing she would face consequences proportional to the harm she'd caused. But another part, smaller and harder to acknowledge, felt something like grief for the family we might have been if Victoria had chosen differently, if she'd been capable of loving us rather than using us. I was in the sunroom working at my grandmother's wheel when I heard a car pull up the gravel drive, tires crunching in that distinctive pattern that meant someone unfamiliar with the property's layout. I wiped clay from my hands and walked to the window, surprised to see Cassidy's sedan parking near the front entrance. We hadn't planned to meet today, and she rarely drove out to Thornwood without advance notice, still uncomfortable with the memories the estate held and the person she'd been when she lived here under Victoria's influence. She emerged from the car carrying something wrapped in brown paper, moving with purpose toward the house. I met her at the front door before she could knock, and she thrust the package toward me with a mixture of nervousness and determination. Inside the wrapping was a ceramic piece she'd clearly made herself, a bowl that was lumpy and uneven and obviously the work of someone just learning the craft. The glaze was applied unevenly, dripping in some places and too thin in others, and the overall shape suggested the clay had fought her during every stage of construction. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Not because it was technically accomplished or aesthetically perfect, but because it represented my sister trying, choosing to learn something difficult and uncomfortable rather than staying safely within the narrow range of skills Victoria had approved. She watched my face anxiously as I turned the bowl in my hands, clearly worried I might critique or dismiss her first attempt at pottery. Instead, I pulled her into a hug, feeling her tension dissolve as she realized I understood what this gift represented. "I signed up for classes at that community center near my apartment," she said when I finally released her. "The instructor is patient, which is good because I'm terrible at this. But I keep thinking about what you said about creating something honest, about making things with your own hands instead of just buying whatever looks impressive." She paused, tucking hair behind her ear in a gesture that reminded me of our grandmother. "I wanted you to have the first thing I made that didn't completely collapse. It's not much, but it's real." We spent the afternoon in the sunroom, me working on a commission piece while Cassidy watched and asked questions about technique and clay chemistry and how long it took before working at the wheel stopped feeling like fighting against the material. I showed her my grandmother's old tools, explained how different firing temperatures created different effects. Let her try centering clay on the wheel even though her first several attempts resulted in muddy disasters that splattered across both our clothes. She laughed when the clay flew off the wheel during a particularly aggressive attempt at centering, a genuine sound of joy that I couldn't remember hearing from her in years. As sunset approached and golden light flooded across the vineyard, turning the rows of vines into rivers of amber and shadow, Cassidy stood at the window with a cup of tea warming her hands. "Do you think you'll stay here?" she asked quietly. "At Thornwood, I mean. After everything Victoria did, all the memories this place holds, do you think you can make it feel like home?" I considered the question while watching light play across the valley my ancestors had chosen and cultivated. Land that had survived economic depressions and prohibition and family dysfunction and systematic fraud. The manor behind us held generations of history, some beautiful and some terrible, all of it woven together into the complicated tapestry that was the Harper legacy. Victoria had tried to erase the parts of that history she found inconvenient and amplify the parts that served her purposes, but the truth was more complex than any single narrative could contain. "I think home isn't something you find," I said finally. "It's something you build one honest choice at a time." Thornwood was broken long before Victoria arrived, and it'll take years to repair the damage she did. But grandmother wanted me to have it because she believed I understood that preservation isn't about keeping everything the same. It's about honoring what was good while being honest about what was broken, and having the courage to build something better from what remains. Cassidy nodded slowly, and I could see her processing not just my words but their implications for her own life, for how she might build something real from the wreckage of the identity Victoria had constructed for her. We stood together in comfortable silence, two sisters learning how to be family without the weight of manipulation and competition, watching as the valley transformed in the dying light. Before she left, Cassidy paused at the console table in the entrance hall where our grandmother's Ming-style vase still sat, the porcelain gleaming in the lamplight. She reached out to touch it gently, reverently, the way you might touch something sacred. "Do you remember when we were little and grandmother told us this vase had survived centuries because it was made right?" she asked. "She said beautiful things could be strong if they had good foundations, if the person who made them cared more about truth than appearance." I remembered. It had been one of the last conversations we'd had with our grandmother before she died. The three of us sitting in this same entrance hall while Eleanor explained the history of the vase and what it represented about endurance and integrity. At the time, I'd been young enough to take the lesson at face value, understanding it applied to pottery but not yet recognizing how it applied to families, to relationships, to the choices we make about who we become. Cassidy had been even younger, probably too young to understand the subtext of what our grandmother was really teaching us about the difference between Victoria's flashy performance and the quiet strength of things built to last. "I think she was trying to warn us," Cassidy said softly, her finger tracing the delicate pattern on the vase's surface, "trying to tell us that what looked most impressive wasn't always what mattered most, that we should pay attention to foundations rather than facades." She turned to me with tears shining in her eyes. "I wish I'd understood sooner. I wish I'd chosen differently." "You're choosing differently now," I reminded her gently. "That's what matters. Not the years you spent believing Victoria's stories, but the courage it takes to stop believing them and build something real." We hugged again at the door, and I watched her drive away as twilight deepened into darkness, her taillights disappearing down the long drive beneath the oak canopy. The manor felt different now that she'd left, less empty and more peaceful, as if the building itself was exhaling after holding tension for too long. I returned to the sunroom and sat at my grandmother's wheel, not to work but simply to be present in the space she'd loved, to feel connected across time to the woman who'd understood me better than anyone else in my family. The valley outside had gone dark except for scattered lights from neighboring estates, pinpoints of illumination that marked where other families were living their own complicated stories of legacy and inheritance, and the eternal tension between honoring the past and creating the future. My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel asking if I wanted to grab dinner later in the week, followed by one from my father confirming our coffee date for Sunday morning, followed by another from David checking how the estate transition was progressing, and whether I needed any financial advice about managing the vineyard business. The messages represented the life I was building, the community of people who'd helped me fight for truth, and who remained part of my story, even after the dramatic confrontation had ended and the work of actual living had begun. I thought about Victoria in her cell, about whether she spent her time regretting the choices that had led her there or justifying them through the same mental gymnastics that had allowed her to commit fraud, while believing herself the hero of her own story. I thought about Owen Fletcher, wherever he was, learning that charm and good looks couldn't protect him from consequences once his crimes became public. I thought about all the people who'd enabled Victoria's fraud through willful ignorance or self-interest, the lawyers and accountants and family friends who'd asked no questions because asking would have been inconvenient. But mostly I thought about my grandmother Eleanor, about the legacy she'd intended to pass down and the faith she'd had that I would protect it. She'd been right that Thornwood needed someone who understood preservation meant protecting what was real, rather than what looked impressive. She'd been right that I had the strength to face difficult truths rather than accepting comfortable lies. And she'd been right that sometimes the most important thing you could restore wasn't a building or a piece of pottery, but the integrity of the choices you made about who you wanted to become. I picked up my grandmother's bowl, the one I'd brought from my Portland studio and placed in the window where light could transform it, and I understood finally what she'd been trying to teach me all those years ago. That beauty and strength came from the same source. That things made with honest hands and patient attention could survive forces that would shatter what was merely decorative. That the cracks and imperfections from surviving damage were marks of authenticity, rather than flaws to be hidden or ashamed of. Tomorrow I would wake up as the owner of Thornwood Manor, responsible for decisions about the vineyard and the business and the dozens of people whose livelihoods depended on choices I made. Tomorrow I would continue the slow work of transformation, turning Victoria's showpiece back into my grandmother's vision of home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and probably new revelations about damage I hadn't yet discovered. But tonight, in this moment of quiet peace with clay beneath my fingernails and my grandmother's will waiting patiently for morning, I was simply someone who had chosen truth and survived the choosing. That felt like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.